Greetings, everyone. Welcome, welcome, welcome. I am so glad you're here. Thanks for tuning in. Tonight, we'll be continuing our reading. We will continue our reading of Negro Pilgrimage in America by by Eric Lincoln, page 32. Last night, we had some interesting information that we learned about the origins and the early bondage of the African in America. Today we'll be talking about the abolitionist movement.
Greetings. My name is the Revolutionary Matron, and my show is called The Learning Curve. I broadcast on a network called KWAZ Radio. There are other hosts on the network I'd like you to meet.
Greetings, everyone. This is Koku from the Bitter Medicine Podcast, inviting you to tune in to the Bitter Medicine Podcast on KWAZ Radio.
Peace, family. This is Oni, inviting you to listen to the pro-Black perspective, where Black problems are addressed with Black solutions.
This is D Webb with the Harsh Reality Podcast, asking you to tune in where we tackle the news of the day that affects our community, only on KWAZ Radio.
The views, thoughts, and opinions expressed here belong solely to the respondent, and they do not necessarily reflect any broadcast networks, affiliates, nor sponsors. The Learning Curve is a broadcast created for the benefit of my global community. Black is a consciousness. Content is being used for our commentary, research, criticism, education, scholarship, teaching, preaching, and news reporting. No copyright infringement is intended. I will make enunciation mistakes. I will give you my opinion about the information. And if you ever ask, I will send you my source.
Toward abolition. The westward expansion of the United States demanded a labor force that could, within the context of 19th century American economic morality, be provided only by slave labor. The early 1800s saw a 1,000-mile area stretching from South Carolina to Texas become one of the world's most productive agricultural regions. The area was especially suited to long growing periods, thus permitting several crops to be harvested in a single season. So it was all about the money. The key crop was cotton, and that plant became virtual king of the southern United States. The Louisiana Purchase of 1803 opened up additional lands for cultivation and provided the foundation for what came to be known as America's manifest destiny. That doctrine was viewed differently in the North and in the South. Southerners, by and large, viewed manifest destiny as the simple policy of expansion across the continent by whatever means were available. For many Northerners, westward expansion and manifest destiny meant establishing an empire for liberty. So there were two conflicting understandings of what manifest destiny even means. Greetings, Forecast. How are you tonight? While spectacular economic events were taking place in the slave-holding South, the anti-slavery movement was gaining strength in the North. And remember, it's because the Northerners couldn't get jobs. The Negro had not become an important social or economic factor in the North, mainly because slavery had never been firmly entrenched there. Hence, anti-slavery sentiment in the North was more pronounced than in the South. However, sentiment had not crystallized in terms of exactly what should be done about slavery or how. Many Northerners were indifferent to the entire question, So they didn't care one way or the other. On the other hand, a large segment of the population was against slavery in principle and looked forward to its eventual end. Such moderates of the pre Civil War period hoped to contain slavery in the states where it existed, expecting its ultimate demise as a socioeconomic anachronism unable to survive its own weight. So they felt that the burdens of slavery, because there were laws about what the slaves ate, what they got to wear, the holidays that they got to celebrate, kind of sort of like what you do today when you go to a job. The radical abolitionist movement advocated absolute and immediate freedom for the Negro, but it was opposed by many Northerners who feared the sudden release of 4 million Negroes into an established white society as a major threat to social stability. So even the abolitionists had their views, thinking that it wouldn't be safe for them to release 4 million Negroes into an established white society. Probably the most vocal of all the white abolitionists was William Lloyd Garrison, the fiery editor of The Liberator. Garrison's inflammatory anti-slavery editorials represented the height of 19th century American militancy, and in 1835, that militancy almost cost him his life when a group of well-dressed Bostonians attacked and beat him. The incident moved another Bostonian, Wendell Phillips, to abandon his own career and become Garrison's principal aide. Phillips was a lawyer and Harvard graduate that rose to prominence in the abolition movement after his 1837 speech in Boston protesting the murder of Elijah P. Lovejoy, an Alton, Illinois abolitionist editor. Phillips' trained legal mind was a necessary balance for Garrison's emotionalism. The abolitionist campaign was the channel through which the American Negro came into being. John B. Russwurm, an alumnus of Bowdoin College, was the first Negro to graduate with a degree from an American college. In 1827, he founded the nation's first Negro paper, called Freedom's Journal, in New York City. 10 years later, with Philip A. Bell, a publisher, and Samuel E. Cornish as editor, the Weekly Advocate was launched. Frederick Douglass later began publishing the North Star. Two prominent Negro historians also contributed to world awareness of the evils of slavery. Their names were William C. Nell, a Bostonian that devoted his life to writing a series of scholarly historical works, while William Wells Brown abandoned a career as a physician to become a historian. Several Southern states responded to abolitionist pressure by enacting or strengthening manumission laws, and Maryland adopted a policy aimed at colonizing the slaves in Africa. With some financial aid from the federal government, the American Colonization Society was formed in 1817, virtually creating what is now the African state of Liberia. More than 1,000 manumitted slaves were sent to that infant nation, many solely on the condition upon release they would leave American soil and return to Africa. The general condition of manumission laws provided that freed slaves leave the states where they had lived. That requirement sent large numbers of Negroes flooding into the North. The influx contributed to a stiffening of attitudes against Negroes in several communities. For example, between 1807 and 1838, New York, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, and Connecticut either disenfranchised Negroes or required extremely high property holdings as a qualification to vote. In Ohio, each freed Negro entering the state was required to post a bond of $500. Indiana and Illinois took similar restrictive measures. Generally, the South viewed the free Negro as an infection that could destroy the entire framework of slavery. So it was a threat to have a free Negro in your presence. The North was afraid that the free Negro would affect the labor market adversely and resented the fact that Negroes, generally without property holdings, were a potential drain upon tax-paying landowners. Actually, in several American cities, free Negroes were a significant segment of the tax-paying population. By 1832, free Negroes in Philadelphia had amassed taxable property worth $350,000, a figure that rose to more than $400,000 by 1847. In Cincinnati, Ohio, Negro property holdings totaled $228,000 by 1840. Negro economic progress was not restricted to the North. Jehu Jones, a free Negro, owned the largest hotel interest in Charleston, South Carolina, with holdings estimated in excess of $40,000. In New Orleans, Thomas LaFon, a merchant, had an estimated fortune worth $500,000, while in Macon, Georgia, Solomon Humphreys was the area's most prosperous grocer with assets exceeding $20,000. The 1830 federal census also reported some 3,777 Negro heads of families were slaveholders, but we know that those were probably the ones that could pass for white, with holdings concentrated in North and South Carolina, Virginia, and Maryland. The Underground Railroad. Although the slave trade was officially outlawed in 1808, the transatlantic slave trade was officially outlawed in 1808. The only immediate practical change was that it became unofficially a part of American life. The development of internal slave trading and slave breeding became major Southern enterprises as the nation expanded westward. Slave breeding for the auction block was unquestionably the most dehumanizing aspect of slavery. The auction block was often the spur that sent the Negro on a break for freedom. Runaway slaves became, in fact, such a major problem in the South that in 1793, a benign federal government enacted the first of two fugitive slave laws. The laws required that all good citizens assist federal marshals and their deputies in apprehending runaway slaves. Fugitive slave laws were heavily weighted against the Negro. He was denied a jury trial in federal courts. His testimony was inadmissible, and the unsupported sworn statement of an alleged but absent owner often was the main evidence offered against the Negro accused of being a runaway slave. So that means that they didn't have to have any evidence to just re-enslave or to enslave any free Black person, because if an alleged absent owner could claim ownership of you and you couldn't testify or offer evidence because that was inadmissible and your sworn statement wasn't admissible, you couldn't allow testimony, you couldn't provide evidence, then anybody was subject to being enslaved even if they were free. In reaction, many Northerners formerly unconcerned about slavery soon became ardent abolitionists. Some Northern states even passed local laws nullifying the fugitive statutes. With the return of veterans from the War of 1812, many Negroes first heard of Canada and realized that freedom lay just across the Ohio River. It soon became commonly known among the slaves that by following the North Star, they could escape into free territory. Slave owners were so mystified by the increase of runaways that they began to speculate that their slaves had escaped on some sort of underground railroad. The railroad, or UG, was in fact an elaborate network of secret contacts between between free Negroes and white sympathizers. The forecast says fugitive slave law led to many quote unquote free black children being kidnapped and sold into slavery. It absolutely did. So, free Negroes and white sympathizers set up to help escaped slaves reach freedom. That's what the Underground Railroad was. There is no accurate account. There is no accurate count of the number of Negroes who actually passed through the system, although one widely accepted estimate is that each year during the 30 years following 1830, as many as 2,000 slaves traveled the Underground Railroad to freedom. Supported by Quakers and other friendly whites, the Underground Railroad depended mainly upon Negro bravery for much of its success. Among the many Negroes whose names were prominent in the movement were those of William Wells Brown, George the Baptist, Martin Delany, Frederick Douglass, James Forten, Henry Highland Garnett, J.W. Logan, Lewis Hayden, Charles Redmond, David Ruggles, William Still, Sojourner Truth, David Walker, Samuel Ward, and Theodore Wright. One of the bravest and most dramatic operators of the Underground Railroad was a Negro woman named Harriet Tubman. After escaping from slavery at the age of 29, Miss Tubman made repeated trips back to the South to bring out other Negroes. She is credited with personally leading more than 300 slaves north to freedom. Miss Tubman was apparently a peculiarly single-minded young woman who often brandished a loaded revolver to urge frightened or timid members of her caravans. At one time, slaveholders offered as much as $40,000 for her capture, but she survived and served with Union Army forces during the Civil War, first as a nurse and later as a spy behind Confederate lines. Issues at the North and South. Because of the emotions it aroused, slavery became a symbol of the growing chasm between Northern and Southern economic interests and cultural outlooks. Visible manifestation of the difference was that one region continued to hold slaves and the other did not. Each sought to influence newly developing Western territories. The presence or absence of slaves in those territories, which looked forward to entering the Union as states, came to be interpreted as a practical symbol of the political, social, and economic philosophies of the people who lived in them. So, whether you were a free state or a slave state, had a lot to do with your economy and what you actually plan to do in that area. Our young nation was already deeply involved in sectional issues before slavery became the recognized cause of war. Conflicting economic interests were latent but powerful ones in the controversy. The North, with its small farms and free labor, found it difficult to sympathize with Southern plantations operating on slave labor. Southern planters, in search of cheap commodities through free trade, were angered by high tariffs that protected the Northern industrialists but frustrated the South's desire for open markets. Thousands of European immigrants arriving at Eastern ports and settling in the North and Midwest threatened to upset the political balance between the North and the South. The abolitionists demanded the end of slavery in the name of a higher law ordained by God, a law to which all state and federal laws should conform. It was argued that the brotherhood of man was explicit and scripture implicit in the Declaration of Independence, and that it was morally and legally unjust to exclude Negroes from the benefits of either. If any one thing most affected the mood and temper of the abolitionist feeling in the North, it was the publication of a novel by Harriet Beecher Stowe. On March 20th, 1852, the first edition of Uncle Tom's Cabin was published. This book was to shape pre-Civil War America's image of the slave and his master, and it defined the issues all Americans had to face. It revealed the cruelty and horror of slavery and the human and noble qualities of people held in bondage. Its major point was that the Negro wanted his freedom from a system founded on the brutality and evil, and that he would fight and die for that freedom and the freedom of his family and friends. In the years that followed, Harriet Beecher Stowe became the most popular representative of the abolitionist movement, and today Uncle Tom's Cabin has become, if sentimental with cliches, a classic of American literature, and it's also on the banned book list in many schools. Slaveholders rejected both biblical and political arguments and advanced counter arguments. Southerners used the Bible to, quote unquote, prove justification of slavery by identifying Negroes as descendants of Ham, forever ordained to be hewers of wood and drawers of water. Further, the argument continued. There, there was also historical justification for slavery. Since it was practiced by the Greeks and the Romans, who gave the world two of the most brilliant civilizations, then it must be good for America. Besides, slavery had been sanctioned by the philosophers such as Aristotle and John Locke, and alleged to be the normal order and of nature and of God, a boon to the African savage and to civilized Americans alike. Leading Southern spokesmen extolling the benefits of the system insisted that slavery not only civilized the savage, but made him a part of Christian society, but also provided the economic security and necessary leisure for Western civilization to express its inherent cultural genius. The Declaration of Independence equalitarian doctrines were interpreted by the South as having no application to slaves because they had no part in its framing and were at the time of its issuance considered to be a lower order of beings. So that document, in most people's opinion at the time, didn't even apply to us. So don't be a constitutionalist, because the founders and framers in their works tell you that they were not thinking about slaves in that regard. The slave codes. In addition to philosophical answers to the abolitionists, the South also issued a concrete answer, the slave codes. The slave codes dealt with all facets of slave life, from the barring of private meetings, as none were attended unless a white man was present, to the prohibition against entering into or maintaining legal contracts. Violation of the slave codes was punishable by penalties ranging from whipping to branding. As the money from cotton became more important, slaveholders generally refrained from administering punishments that would leave a slave permanently crippled. The breaking of Negroes on the wheel was replaced by merciless floggings. Sometimes more stubborn slaves were burned to death at the stake. Escape was the most serious offense against the slave codes, and often punishment was meted out on the spot if an escaped slave was captured. The slave system grew out of plantation life, and any understanding of slave existence requires an examination of the plantation. The plantation was an organized community, the administration of which rested in the hands of either the owner or, in the majority of cases, a head overseer. You know, like a manager at your job, because you go to a plant every day. The plantation center was its owner's home. Next came the overseer's home, the stables, smokehouses, and corn cribs, and other storage areas. Nearby were the slave quarters, usually one-room huts with earthen floors. With the cash investment involved, it is strange how so many slaveholders gave their human property such poor care. Often slaves were denied sufficient food and clothing. Pregnant Negro women were forced to work out in the fields, and many were unable to bear healthy children. The conditions under which the slaves lived were frequently ignored by the church, although some denominations, notably the Unitarians, were consistently anti-slavery. In some sections of the South, churches actually upheld the practice of slavery. Early in the 19th century, the Methodist Church attacked slavery as a moral blight upon America, but in 1836, the Methodists declared they had no right, wish, or intention of interfering with the civil and political relations between the master and slave as it existed in slaveholding states of the Union. Moreover, many Southern clergymen devoted much of their time to writing pamphlets and lecturing on the alleged inferiority of the Negro, just like today you have a lot of preachers spewing prosperity gospel because that's what people want to hear. So at that time, they wanted to hear about how the Negro was inferior, and they wanted to hear about how there was nothing wrong with the lifestyle that they selected, or how the alphabet soup community is nothing wrong with them, and how that's not an abomination, or how it's okay for people to enter into same-sex relationships. They have an itching ear, okay? The tension within American religious organizations reached a dramatic point in 1844 when the Baptists divided over sending slaveholding missionaries into the expanding Southwest. Similarly, the Methodists are also split over whether one of their ecclesiastical officers, who was named Bishop James Andrew, could hold such high office and retain the slaves he had acquired through marriage. So you see how he was a bishop in that church, and he had inherited slaves, but he didn't want to let them go. He didn't want to let them go. The Missouri Compromise. The slavery issue was a constant shadow over the westward expansion of the United States. The portion of the Louisiana Purchase that became the Missouri Territory grew steadily in population, and in 1818, the territory sought admission to the Union as a full-fledged state. Because so many of the territory's white inhabitants had come from the South, it was assumed that Missouri would join the Union as a slave state. New York Congressman James Tallmadge, who was a pro-abolitionist, set out to prevent the assumption becoming fact. Tallmadge tried to amend the bill proposing the territory's admission so that the importation of slaves would be barred by the state's constitution. He also wanted the eventual emancipation of all slaves who had been born into the territory. The Tallmadge Amendment passed the House of Representatives in February of 1819, but the Senate rejected the proposal. So you see that even at that time, Senate was against Black people. When Alabama joined the Union in 1819, its admission continued a numerical balance in the Senate between the slave and free states. That balance was threatened in 1820 when Maine proposed for admission and Southern politicians were forced to compromise. The separate bills sponsoring Maine and Missouri were combined into one single measure. Under the compromise scheme, slavery would not be prohibited in the Missouri state constitution. In a sense, the Tallmadge faction suffered a defeat. The liberals, however, were able to promote one important stipulation, as a result of which Congress required a pledge from the Missouri legislature that its new constitution would not abridge the rights of United States citizens, thus protecting those freedmen living in the state. The Dred Scott decision. In 1834, Dr. John Emerson, a U.S. Army surgeon, moved from Missouri to Illinois. Dr. Emerson took with him Dred Scott, a Negro slave who later married and raised a family while living with Dr. Emerson in Wisconsin. Dr. Emerson and Scott returned to Missouri in 1838. After Dr. Emerson died, Scott sued Mrs. Emerson for his freedom on the grounds that his residence in the free territories of Illinois and Wisconsin had ended his bondage. Mrs. Emerson and her new husband, who was a prominent abolitionist congressman, Dr. C.C. Chaffee, developed a plan. The Chaffees wanted to get the Scott case into a federal court in hope that a favorable decision for the Negro servant would create a precedent upon which other slaves could gain freedom with the backing of the judiciary. To avoid having Dr. Chaffee appear in court as a defendant slaveholder, Scott was technically sold to Mrs. Chaffee's brother, J.F.A. Stanford. The case was then heard in several lower courts and eventually reached the U.S. Supreme Court. With white Southerners dominating the court, Mr. Chief with white Southerners dominating the court, Mr. Chief Justice Roger Taney handed down a decision that proclaimed slavery a national concept and freedom a strictly sectional consideration. Justice Taney ruled that Negroes did not come within the meaning of the Constitution's meaning, people of the United States. The court held that a Negro had no rights which a white man need respect. In a very real sense, the Civil War began in Kansas, where abolitionists and pro-slavery forces confronted each other over the sights of their rifles. On May 21st, 1856, pro-slavery forces raided and sacked Lawrence, Kansas. A few days later, John Brown, who was a religious visionary and abolitionist, led a group of anti-slavery followers into Lawrence and murdered 5 pro-slavery men. For 2 years, bands of abolitionists called Jayhawkers and other pro-slavery guerrillas terrorized the Kansas countryside. More than 200 people were killed and nearly $250,000 worth of property destroyed before relative calm was restored to that area. Kansas represented an abolitionist victory, for the state's constitution was amended to forbid slavery. John Brown continued his energetic battle against slavery and capped his abolitionist career with a raid on Harper's Ferry, Virginia. John Brown intended to make Harper's Ferry a stronghold where escaping Negroes could assemble and press their campaign for freedom. On October 16, 1859, John Brown and a handful of guerrillas seized the federal arsenal and took possession of the town. Federal troops, led by Colonel Robert E. Lee, attacked the town, and after a bloody battle, Brown and a few of his followers were captured. Brown was hanged on December 2, 1859. The reports of his execution indicate that he went to his death acting as the great martyr of the abolitionist movement, warning the nation that what had happened at Harper's Ferry was only a prelude to a real war to end slavery. By 1861, his prophecy became reality, and the nation was to be made free of slavery by blood. Greetings, greetings, Brother Bakari. How are you tonight? The forecast says he knew he was going to bring up John Brown. That's BS. Exactly. John Brown is like a mythical type feature. There are several images in this book, but see, Eric Lincoln had his hopes and ideals. He had his interesting ideas about it. There are some interesting concepts in here. I think what we need to take away from this is that at that time and to this day, they feel like the court held that there are no rights, that a white man need respect. We need to keep that in mind. We need to keep in mind that we are our own saviors and that our authors and that our writers of history are the ones we need to yield to. Um, we need to get to the point where we look to the Black people like Martin Delany and Carlos A. Cooks that wrote and that did abolitionist work. You know, they have that whole white savior complex idea, but unfortunately, we have to get over it. We have to first get over the idea that they can save us, and we have to know that we can save ourselves. I'm going to start reading chapter 4 tonight. The Civil War and Emancipation. And yes, they're going to talk about Abraham Lincoln. By the middle of the 19th century, there were acute sectional differences as to whether the new states admitted to the Union would be slaveholding or free. The Compromise of 1850 attempted to improve relations by setting up a balanced set of conditions for future admission of new states, and by clarifying the slave issue in the District of Columbia. Thereby, California was admitted to the Union as a free state. New Mexico and Utah territories were organized on the principle of popular sovereignty, and the slave trade was ended in Washington, D.C. Both sides gained and gave concessions. By the 1850 compromise, but the 1850 compromise could not hold together two sections of the country with such disparate interests. Each became more nationalistic in terms of its own attitudes, and each became more certain that the other must take and make some extensive social and political modifications if the Union were to be maintained. The Republican position. The presidential campaign of 1860 ended the Republic in Republican victory, but the grand old party was not united under one general philosophy. Led by New York Senator William H. Seward, the conservatives were mildly anti-slavery. Their main concern was enacting legislation that would bring more rapid growth to the industrial North. After winning the election, Lincoln, the conservative spokesman, paid a political debt to Seward by appointing him Secretary of State. The radical Republicans were a divided lot. The old radicals, led by Thaddeus Stevens and Charles Sumner, were abolitionists openly committed to Negro freedom. The new radicals, although against slavery in principle, were more so deeply concerned with the social benefits for the growing numbers of industrial workers. Lincoln's election was a bitter blow to the South, which apparently misread Republican views and chalked up the results as a victory for the abolitionists. South Carolina led a succession from the Union, and before Lincoln could be inaugurated, Florida, Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, and Texas had also left the Union. On the morning of April 12, 1861, Confederate forces opened fire on Fort Sumter in Charleston Harbor. President Lincoln had sought to avoid a military clash, but now he was forced to use troops to preserve the Union. His decision forced Virginia to take sides, and Virginia joined the Confederacy. Arkansas, North Carolina, and Tennessee also joined the Confederate States of America. 4 slave states, Delaware, Missouri, Kentucky, and Maryland, remained in the Union. The western counties of Virginia broke with the South, formed the state of West Virginia, and joined the Union. With the nation split, Lincoln made it plain that his greatest aim was to reunite and preserve the Union. Although the president was personally opposed to slavery on humanitarian grounds, it was his conviction that the federal government had no right to prohibit slavery in the South. Lincoln did, however, believe Congress should prevent slavery from being extended into the Western territories. His opposition to the Western growth of slavery was based upon the fear that slave labor would have an adverse effect upon the growth of newly opened sections of the nation. In a letter he wrote to Horace Greeley shortly after the war began, the president stated his position. And he says, "My paramount object in this struggle is to save the Union, and is not either to save nor destroy slavery. If I could save the Union without freeing any slave, I would do it. If I could save the Union by freeing all the slaves, I would do it. And if I could save it by freeing some and leaving others alone, I would also do it. What I do about slavery and the colored race, I do because I believe it helps to save the Union." So, in his own words, he doesn't care about Black people. He only cared about the preservation and salvation of the Union itself. The forecast says, but notice there were still slave states in the Union or in the North. Absolutely. And they were supposed to set their slaves free January 1st of 1862, I think it was. But on January 1st, they were supposed to free the slaves in those slave holding states. As soon as Union forces penetrated the South, it became clear that some more definitive solution was required concerning the Negro. Runaway slaves often met Union forces and attached themselves to the blue-clad troops, and they were treated badly by those troops in many instances. On the plantations overrun by Union soldiers, the Negroes were nominally slaves but technically free. Many field commanders found themselves not only waging war against rebels, but also forced to provide food and shelter for large numbers of homeless slaves, and they resented it. A small scandal erupted in July of 1861 when it was learned that President Lincoln had directed General Winfield Scott to assist Virginia slaveholders seeking runaway slaves. But in less than a month, Congress passed the first Confiscation Act, providing that runaway slaves who had been used to aid the Confederacy could be granted freedom once they were under the Union Army control. As General Sherman pressed his attack down the South Carolina coast, he was directed to use former slaves as laborers and in any other way he might, quote unquote, deem most beneficial to the service. This, however, not being a general arming of them for service. So they could go and be used as cannon fodder, but they couldn't get a gun. When Sherman was transferred, he was replaced by an abolitionist officer, General David Hunter, faced with an acute manpower shortage, and after pleading with Washington for reinforcements, General Hunter organized an all-Negro regiment, the 1st South Carolina Volunteers. Later, he was forced to disband most of the regiment, although one company remained on active duty. On July 17, 1862, Congress passed a second Confiscation Act, granting freedom to all slaves held by masters supporting the Confederacy. 5 days after the Union victory at Antietam on September 22, 1862, President Lincoln issued a preliminary Emancipation Proclamation. Shortly thereafter, General B.F. Butler organized the 1st Regiment Louisiana Heavy Artillery, an all-Negro unit. The War Department then authorized organization of the 1st all-Negro regular Army combat units. The first activated were the Massachusetts 54th and the 55th Infantry Regiments. By the end of the war, there were approximately 150 all-Negro regiments in the Union Army. The final Emancipation Proclamation on January 1st, 1863 proclaimed that all persons held as slaves within any state or designated part of the state, the people thereof shall be in rebellion against the United States, shall be thenceforth and forever free. It should be noted that the 1863 proclamation contained no provisions not already provided for by the Congress of the Confiscation Act of 1862. However, bearing the signature of the president and being his sole act, give me one moment, it was of tremendous psychological importance. So the Emancipation Proclamation only had psychological importance. The proclamation was issued as an executive order, but it became the law of the land with the ratification of the 13th Amendment to the Constitution on December 18, 1865. And that's the amendment that makes involuntary servitude illegal and unconstitutional. But you can agree to be a slave. Do you agree to be a slave every day you go to work? The Negro in the Union Army. With the Draft Act in operation, 1863 saw the recruitment of Negro soldiers into the Union Army under the designation United States Colored Troops, or the USCT. The majority of the United States Colored Troops were commanded by white officers, many of whom resented their assignments. So can you imagine how they treated these people? Greetings, KW97. Enjoy your workout. Before the war ended, however, approximately 75 Negroes had been commissioned as officers and served in the field. One of the most famous Negro officers was Lieutenant Colonel William Reed, who lost his life during a charge of Confederate positions during the Battle of Olustee, Florida. While Negroes had fought for the Union in 1863, it was not until a year later that Congress granted Black soldiers the same pay as white troops. The two Massachusetts regiment were so angered by the pay discrimination that they refused all money until their pay was made equal to that of their white comrades in arms. Time and time again, the Negro soldiers proved themselves brave and competent fighting men. When General Grant attacked Petersburg, a brigade of Negro troops overran the Confederate rifle pits. At the Battle of Port Hudson during the Mississippi Valley Campaign, General Banks praised the Negro soldiers. Their conduct was so heroic that no troops could be more determined or more daring. Captain Matthew Miller gave this account of the Negro troops who had fought at the Battle of Milliken's Bend. So they fought and died, defending the cause that we revere. They met death coolly, bravely, nor rashly did they expose themselves, but all were steady and obedient to orders. The forecast says voluntary servitude. That's what, yeah, voluntary servitude is legal. When Confederate soldiers captured Negro Union officers, the Black men were rarely treated as prisoners of war. If they were not killed on the spot, they were taken as slaves. On April 12th of 1864, General Nathan Forrest and his Confederate troops captured the Union stronghold at Fort Pillow, 40 miles north of Memphis, Tennessee. Half the garrison consisted of Negro troops, and the rebels ruthlessly killed every Negro they found. By the end of the war, 200,000 Negroes had served in the Union Army, and more than 38,000 had given their lives. The Congressional Medal of Honor, created during the Civil War as the nation's highest military award for valor in combat against an armed enemy, was awarded to 22 Negro soldiers. The war ends. The Civil War finally ended at Appomattox Courthouse in Central Virginia on April 9, 1865. The terms of surrender were not vindictive, although the harsh realities of defeat lay heavily upon the mind of the Southerner. The Southern armies were disbanded and the men were sent back to their homes to face the new social and political challenges that lay before them. There were, of course, some voices in the North that cried out for vengeance against the treason and rebellion of the South, but for the most part, however, sanity and a desire to restore the South to full status in the Union prevailed among the responsible government leaders in Washington, D.C. That feels like a propaganda piece right there. That although there were people calling out for treason and rebellion against the South and for them to be vindicated, and that vengeance must be held against them, that they have to be held accountable for what they did, but that these cooler heads that prevailed in Washington, D.C. said that they didn't have to pay any penalties. That feels like a propaganda piece. That's what happened, but I don't necessarily think it was this cool-headed, calm thing that they make it out to be. In spite of a popular demand for his life, Jefferson Davis, the Confederate president, was not hanged. In fact, he was never even brought to trial. There were no harsh and protracted war trials followed by mass imprisonment of war criminals. Henry Wurz, superintendent of the Confederate prison at Andersonville, Georgia, was the only Confederate to lose his life for crimes committed during the war. The conflict had irrevocably settled two issues. The Union was to remain intact, which was Lincoln's only goal, and the slaves were to be free. The political integrity of the United States and the principle of inherent inviolability of human freedom had been established for all time. Beyond the restoration of the Union and the emancipation of the slaves, however, there was little agreement among the various Northern and Southern factions on what should be done now. When and in what manner might seceded states regain their political sovereignty? What was to be done about the status of ex-slaves? And how was the Southern economy to be rebuilt in the absence of slave labor? Those were the prevailing questions that they had. Those were the prevailing challenges that they had. Next time, we're going to talk about Reconstruction, the Reconstruction period. But their biggest question was, what were they going to do about their economy, because they had just lost their labor force. And they figured it out. They abused the laws. They created Jim Crow. They lynched people. They did a lot of things to rebuild their economy and to reinforce their sovereignty. So as you can see, the fight for abolition and emancipation in this country has not been an easy fight. It has been a fight that we've continued to it's been a fight we've continued to fight for a long time, trying to get our rights, trying to have the franchise. All right, guys, it's been an hour. I thank each and every one of you. I want to say thank you to the Forecast, to Brother Bakari, and to KW Don 7 for hanging out with me for this hour. I know that Bawana Hagaziki is listening. I know that that Sister Raw and the elders that listen with her are listening. I know that the staff at Jesse's Kids and the staff at the Daycare Ladies Network are listening. I know that Tinkerbell 87 is listening. I know that Realm in the Bush is listening. I know that Afro Native is listening, and you, yes, even you are listening. I thank each and every one of you, and I'll see you tomorrow at 7 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. Thank you so much for listening and tuning in. Peace, guys.